Vikings could have built towering wooden halls like everyone else in medieval Europe. They had the skills, the timber, the manpower, but instead, they chose to bury themselves alive underground. And the reason isn't what archaeologists originally assumed. There's something about these hidden turf houses that modern architects are now desperately trying to replicate. Minus 40 degrees. That's not a typo. Scandinavian winters regularly drop to temperatures that could kill an exposed human in under an hour. And here's the thing about wooden buildings in those conditions. They're basically fancy coffins. Heat escapes through the walls faster than you can burn logs. So the Vikings did something clever. They went underground. See, soil has this weird property that most people don't think about. Dig down just a few feet, and the temperature stays around 50 degrees year-round. Doesn't matter if there's a blizzard above. Doesn't matter if it's the coldest night in a century. That dirt holds steady like a natural thermostat. The walls, 6 feet thick in some cases, that's not a house. That's a fortress made of earth. Modern insulation experts would rate those turf walls around R60. For reference, most homes today barely hit R13. And fuel consumption? This is where it gets interesting. A wooden longhouse needed 3 fires burning constantly just to keep people from freezing. A turf house the same size, 1 small hearth. That's it. Vikings figured out that digging 3 feet down cut their firewood needs nearly in half. Archaeological teams have actually tested this. They built replica turf houses, stuck thermometers inside, and waited for winter storms. While blizzards raged outside, interiors reached a comfortable 65 degrees. My heating bill last winter would have made a Viking faint. But staying warm was only part of the equation, because here's what most history books skip over. Vikings weren't just the raiders. They got raided too. And those turf roofs, they served a completely different purpose that had nothing to do with temperature. Here's the thing about Vikings that most people get backwards. They weren't just raiders. They got raided too. Coastal settlements faced constant attacks from rival clans, foreign enemies, and honestly, other Vikings who figured turnabout was fair play. Living in a visible wooden hall was basically putting a "rob me" sign on your roof. So they got clever. Turf roofs grew grass and wildflowers within weeks of construction. From a ship approaching the coast, your house looked like a small hill. From a hilltop scout position, just another bump in the landscape. And we're not talking about one family hiding. Entire settlements of 200 people could effectively disappear. From a quarter mile away, their homes looked like natural hillocks. You could walk right past a village and never know it existed. The Icelandic sagas actually mention this happening. Enemies searched for villages for days without finding them. Days, while literally standing on top of the houses they were looking for. That's some next-level hide-and-seek right there. But smoke was the problem, right? Cooking fires send up columns that scream, "People live here," to anyone watching. Vikings solved this too. They channeled smoke through angled tunnels that dispersed it across wide areas. No telltale column, just faint wisps that looked like morning mist. Then there's the entrance situation. One narrow doorway. That's it. Weapons mounted right beside it. One defender could hold off several attackers because only one person could squeeze through at a time. Your home wasn't just hidden. It was a fortress. But staying hidden and staying defended meant nothing if your food rotted before spring arrived. Now, here's where Vikings really earned their genius points. They figured out something that took modern humans until the 1800s to understand scientifically. Underground temperatures stay cold. Consistently cold. The kind of cold that keeps food from turning into a science experiment. We're talking 35 to 45 degrees year-round. That's your refrigerator. Without electricity, without Freon, without a monthly bill. Vikings dug separate chambers called bur, deeper than their living quarters, specifically for storing butter, cheese, and dried fish. And these weren't tiny closets. Some could hold enough provisions to feed a family for 6 months straight. But here's the crazy part. A well-designed food cellar kept smoked salmon edible for up to 3 years. 3 years. I can barely keep leftover pizza fresh for 3 days. The constant cool temperature slowed bacterial growth so effectively that archaeologists have actually found 1,000-year-old butter in Scandinavian bogs. Still recognizable as butter. Still technically edible, though I wouldn't recommend trying it. And then there's hakarl, fermented shark, a Viking delicacy that Icelanders still eat today. This stuff required those exact underground temperature conditions to cure properly. Too warm, rotten poison, too cold, never ferments right. The Vikings nailed it perfectly, every single time. Makes you wonder how many trial and error batches happened before they figured out the sweet spot. Probably a lot of very sick Vikings along the way. These underground pantries meant families could survive entire winters when hunting and fishing became impossible. No grocery stores, no delivery apps, just smart engineering and a hole in the ground. But storing food was only half the challenge. They also needed materials to build with, and that's where things got complicated. Now here's where things get interesting. Iceland and Greenland were basically treeless wastelands. A Viking sailing from Norway expecting forests? Massive disappointment. Timber became rarer than silver, literally. They'd trade precious metal for decent lumber. So what do you build with when there's nothing to build with? You use what's everywhere. Turf. Free dirt with grass attached. It regrows in 2 seasons after you harvest it. Try getting that deal at Home Depot. A single longhouse needed roughly 20,000 cubic feet of turf blocks. That's not a typo, 20,000. And cutting them required specialized iron tools shaped like oversized ice cream scoops. I'm not making this up. But here's what gets me. Driftwood washing ashore was so precious that Viking laws specified exactly who owned logs found on different beach sections. Beach property rights for sticks. These people weren't messing around. Then there's the stone foundation situation. Building one took weeks of backbreaking labor. But the payoff? Some foundations discovered in Iceland have stayed structurally sound for over 1,100 years. My deck lasted 8 summers before rotting. Makes you feel inadequate, honestly. The timing mattered too. Turf cutting season lasted only a few weeks in late summer. Miss that window and you're stuck. The grass roots needed maximum binding strength to hold blocks together. Cut too early, blocks crumble. Cut too late, roots weaken. Vikings turned limitations into engineering brilliance. No trees, use dirt, no nails, stack blocks strategically. No excuses? Exactly. But having materials is one thing. Stacking 20,000 pounds of earth on a roof without it collapsing? That required something else entirely. Now here's where Viking engineering gets seriously impressive. A fully loaded turf roof weighed between 15,000 and 20,000 pounds. That's roughly the weight of 3 pickup trucks sitting on top of your house. One wrong calculation, the whole thing pancakes your family while they sleep. Vikings solved this with something called the grindverk system. Basically, interlocking timber frames that spread all that crushing weight across dozens of support points instead of just a few. Roman engineers would have nodded approvingly at this design. These Scandinavian farmers figured it out through pure trial and error. But weight wasn't even the trickiest problem. Rain was. And in places like Iceland, it doesn't just rain. It commits to raining for weeks straight. Their solution? Birch bark sandwiched between turf layers. This created waterproofing so effective that interior floors stayed bone dry during month-long storms. I've been in modern buildings with worse leak problems, honestly. Then there's the roof pitch. Had to be exactly 45 degrees. Steeper than that, and your turf slides off like a kid on a wet playground. Shallower and winter snow accumulation crushes everything. Here's the wild part. When wood was impossible to find, some Vikings used whale bones as primary rafters. Whale bones. And these structures sometimes outlasted timber frame buildings because bone doesn't rot like wood does. Maintenance wasn't exactly simple either. Families returfed their roofs every 20 to 30 years. The whole neighborhood showed up to help, turning backbreaking labor into a community event. These roofs were engineering marvels, but even a perfect roof means nothing if Arctic winds tear the heat right out of your home. Arctic winds don't knock on doors. They break them down. We're talking gusts exceeding 60 miles per hour. That kind of force strips heat from a building faster than you can add firewood. Multiple doorways? Might as well invite winter inside for dinner. So Vikings built with exactly one entrance. One. And they positioned it facing away from prevailing winds, typically pointing south or southeast. Generations of weather observation taught them which direction would kill you and which direction might just make you uncomfortable. But here's where it gets clever. The entrance tunnel curved slightly before opening into the main room. Not a straight shot, a bend. This created a natural wind trap. Gusts hit the curve, lost momentum, and dispersed. Meanwhile, people walked through just fine. Simple physics solving a deadly problem. Now, about those door frames. They were built intentionally small, around 5 feet tall. Every adult had to duck. Inconvenient? Sure, but try charging into someone's home with a sword raised when you're bent over like you're looking for a dropped coin. One defender with an axe could hold that entrance against several attackers. My uncle's basement has a similar setup, though his excuse is low ceilings, not Viking tactical design. The doors themselves were heavy wood fitted with turf seals so tight that wind pressure capable of ripping modern doors clean off their hinges barely rattled them. And some homes included antechambers, small entry rooms where you remove snow-covered clothing before entering the main space. Otherwise, that snow melts, refreezes, and suddenly your floor is an ice rink. Smart, right? But all that engineering meant nothing without people to fill these homes. And Viking families, they didn't just live together. Viking turf houses weren't built once and done. They grew. Like adding rooms to your basement, except the basement was your entire house. Here's something most people miss. A young couple didn't start with a mansion. They dig out maybe 300 square feet. Enough for a bed, a hearth, and somewhere to store food. Cozy? Sure. Cramped? Absolutely. But 20 years later, that same home might be 2,000 square feet. The trick was modular design. Want another room? Dig sideways. Cut a doorway through the existing wall. Done. No architect required, no permits, just sweat and a good shovel. And families back then were massive. We're talking 20 people under one roof. Grandparents, parents, kids, aunts, uncles, maybe a servant or two. Everyone connected through winding underground passages. The archaeological site at Stong in Iceland tells this story perfectly. Researchers found a farmstead that started with 3 rooms. 5. Generations later, 11 rooms. That's not a house. That's an underground village. Now here's where Viking practicality really shines. Elderly family members got the rooms closest to the central fire, warmest spots in the house. Meanwhile, younger adults who could handle colder temperatures, they lived in the outer chambers. Makes sense, right? The whole setup meant grandparents helped raise children without ever stepping outside. During those brutal 6-month winters of complete darkness, nobody had to brave the cold just to visit family. They were already there. It was basically the world's first multi-generational living complex, thousands of years before modern architects started calling it innovative housing design. But building these expandable underground homes required something specific, the perfect location, and Vikings had surprisingly scientific methods for finding it. Here's something that might surprise you. Vikings didn't see themselves as conquerors of nature. They saw themselves as guests. Building into the earth wasn't just practical, it was philosophical. The Norse believed in landvetter, land spirits that inhabited every hill, stream, and meadow. Carving up the landscape with massive wooden halls, that was essentially picking a fight with your neighbors, and not the humankind. So they worked with what the land offered. Found a natural slope, build into it. Discovered a hill with good drainage, that's your new home. The terrain wasn't an obstacle to overcome, it was a blueprint to follow. And here's the clever part. When Vikings positioned their homes correctly on hillsides, rainwater just flowed around them. No elaborate drainage systems needed. No channels to dig. Gravity did all the work for free. Pretty smart, right? But there was another benefit nobody talks about. Invisibility. A Viking settlement built this way could remain completely hidden from approaching travelers until they were practically tripping over it. From a distance, you'd see rolling hills and meadows. Nothing more. I've stood on reconstructed sites in Iceland where I knew houses existed. Still couldn't spot them until someone pointed directly at the doorway. Now, this philosophy also meant something remarkable for the future. When Vikings abandoned a farm, which happened regularly during famines or feuds, nature reclaimed it within a single generation. The turf grew over. The walls melted back into hillside. Within 20 years, you'd never know anyone lived there. But choosing the right spot to build wasn't random. There was a science to it. And the selection process, way more complicated than you'd think. Finding the right spot wasn't guesswork. Vikings treated site selection like a science. South-facing hillsides were the gold standard. Why? That door opening caught sunlight for hours, giving you free heat. No fuel required, just clever positioning. But here's where it gets interesting. The slope had to be just right. Too flat and rainwater pooled around your foundation. Too steep and you'd wake up one morning with your bedroom sliding down the hill. Not ideal. Soil testing was serious business. Builders would actually dig test holes before committing to a location. Clay-heavy ground, perfect. It held shape like modeling dough. Sandy soil, might as well build a sandcastle and call it home. Then there's the water situation. You needed a stream or spring close enough that winter trips wouldn't kill you, but not so close that spring flooding turned your living room into a swimming pool. It's like real estate today. Location, location, location. Except getting it wrong meant dying, not just losing your deposit. And Vikings thought about defense constantly. Remember, these people raided others and got raided right back. The best sites let you see approaching ships or riders while you were still inside eating breakfast. Element of surprise works both ways. Here's what really shows their brilliance, though. Some locations were so perfectly chosen that families stayed for over 800 years, generation after generation. Same hillside. Your great-great-great-grandparents picked the spot, and it was still working centuries later. But finding the perfect location was just step one. Now came the real work. Those turf blocks didn't cut themselves, and the techniques Vikings developed would make modern landscapers jealous. Here's the thing about turf cutting. It wasn't just digging up dirt. Vikings developed a specialized tool called the torfliar. Basically, a flat iron spade designed specifically for slicing turf into perfect blocks. And these weren't random chunks. Each block measured 12 to 18 inches wide, 18 to 24 inches long, and about 4 to 6 inches thick. Why those exact dimensions? Because anything bigger was too heavy to carry. Anything smaller fell apart. Now, not all turf was created equal. The best blocks came from old meadows with dense, established root systems. New grass? Forget it. Too weak. The roots would tear apart before you got the block halfway to the building site. Freshly cut blocks were sometimes left to dry for several days. This made them lighter to haul, but still flexible enough to shape around corners. Smart, right? But here's what blows my mind. A single family-sized turf house required thousands of individual blocks. We're talking weeks of backbreaking work just cutting and hauling. Makes my complaints about yard work seem pretty pathetic. And this skill wasn't something you figured out on your own. Experienced turf cutters could slice consistent blocks faster than you'd believe possible. They knew exactly how deep to cut, when to twist the blade, how to stack without crushing. This expertise passed from father to son, mother to daughter, across generations. The torfliar itself was valuable enough to be listed in wills alongside swords and jewelry. So you've got thousands of perfect blocks stacked and ready. But how do you actually turn them into walls that won't collapse? That required a technique Romans would have envied. Now comes the tricky part, actually putting those thousands of blocks together. Vikings didn't just stack turf like bricks. They used a herringbone pattern, alternating each layer so no vertical seams lined up. Why? Because a straight seam is basically an invitation for your wall to split in half. One good freeze-thaw cycle, and boom, you're sleeping under the stars. Smart, right? But here's something most people miss. Every turf house sat on a stone foundation about 1 to 2 feet high. Those bottom blocks couldn't touch wet ground directly, or they'd rot within a single winter. My grandfather used to say, "Wet feet kill houses faster than storms." He was talking about his wooden barn, but Vikings figured this out 1,000 years earlier. The interior skeleton came next. Driftwood or imported timber formed frames that held up the roof and divided rooms, and these builders angled their walls slightly inward as they rose. No nails, no metal brackets, just pure geometry creating natural stability. Then came the tedious part. Every gap between blocks got stuffed with loose soil and moss until the whole structure was completely airtight. Miss a spot and you'd feel that mistake at 3 a.m. when Arctic wind found your face. A crew of 4 to 6 adults could finish the basic walls in roughly 2 weeks. That's faster than most modern contractors return your phone calls, but walls are only half the battle. The roof had to support literal tons of earth while keeping rain out and warmth in, and the Vikings solved this with a material so simple, it's almost insulting. Now here's where everything comes together, literally. The roof wasn't just thrown on top and hoped for the best. There was a specific layering system, and if you messed it up, enjoy your indoor rain shower. First came the wooden rafters. then birch bark, then turf blocks, grass side up. That birch bark layer, absolutely critical. Skip it, and congratulations. You've built a really heavy colander. Rain would seep straight through and drip onto your dinner, your bed, your grandmother. Nobody wants that. The turf layer alone ran 6 to 12 inches thick. And here's a fun number for you. When wet, these roofs could weigh over 10,000 pounds. That's roughly 5 small cars sitting on your ceiling. The support beams better be sturdy or you're having a very bad day. But wait, what about smoke from the cooking fire? Builders left small holes near the roof peak, adjustable vents that let smoke escape without turning your home into a walk-in freezer. It's basically ancient HVAC engineering. Pretty clever for people we sometimes assume just swung axes all day. And here's the part I genuinely love. The grass growing on top, it wasn't decoration. Those roots kept weaving deeper into the turf year after year, actually, making the roof stronger over time. Your house literally improved while you slept. A well-built turf roof lasted 50 to 100 years with regular maintenance. Some lasted over 200, 2 centuries from the same roof. Meanwhile, my apartment complex needs repairs every 6 months. So they had shelter, they had warmth, they had food storage, but how did all these pieces work together as actual homes?